When Ben stumbles upon a mysterious receipt in his home, his seemingly perfect life begins to unravel. His wife, Emily, claims it's work-related, but a trail of secrets leads Ben to suspect otherwise. As he digs deeper, he uncovers shocking betrayals and a sinister connection to someone named Jake, a man who has entangled Emily in a dangerous web of deception and crime. With his family and future at stake, Ben faces an uphill battle to protect his daughters and expose the truth. But the closer he gets, the higher the stakes climb. How far will Ben go to uncover it all? It all started on a quiet evening in 2023. The kind of evening where the world seems to slow down, and life feels just a little too predictable. Ben, a 37-year-old software developer, was sitting on the couch in his modest suburban home, scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly, while his wife, Emily, worked late in her home office upstairs. Ben had always been proud of Emily. She was a dedicated marketing executive, the type who juggled high-stakes deadlines and presentations without breaking a sweat. They had been married for 8 years, a solid partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. Or so Ben thought. Their 2 young daughters, Lily and Claire, were the light of his life, and their cozy home reflected years of shared memories. That night, Ben had a rare moment to himself. The kids were staying with Emily's parents for the weekend, and the house felt unusually quiet. He decided to make the most of the downtime, planning to binge-watch a new series while waiting for Emily to wrap up her work. But as he reached for the remote, something unusual caught his eye. A small piece of paper sticking out from under the coffee table. Curious, Ben leaned down and picked it up. It was a receipt, crumpled but legible. It listed a dinner for 2 at an upscale restaurant downtown. He frowned. The date on the receipt was from 2 nights ago, a night Emily had claimed she was working late at the office. His stomach twisted slightly, but he quickly brushed it off. Emily often met with clients at nice restaurants. It wasn't that unusual. Still, there was something about the receipt that stuck with him. Ben tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and settled back on the couch. But as the night wore on, his mind kept returning to that receipt. Questions buzzed in his head. Who was the dinner with? Why hadn't she mentioned it? He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he also couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something wasn't adding up. The next day, Ben decided to casually bring it up over breakfast. As Emily sipped her coffee and scrolled through her emails, he slid the receipt across the table. "What's this from?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Emily glanced at the receipt, her face remaining unreadable. "Oh, that's from a client dinner," she said smoothly, taking another sip of her coffee. "You know how these things go." Ben nodded, but her response felt too rehearsed, too polished. Normally, she'd share details about her meetings or the quirky clients she dealt with. This time, there was no elaboration, no anecdotes, just a quick explanation and a change of subject. He felt a pang of doubt, but didn't push further. After all, what reason did he have not to trust her? As the week went on, Ben noticed little things that hadn't registered before. Emily's phone, once casually left on counters and coffee tables, now seemed glued to her side. She was texting more often, her screen angled away from his view. When he asked about her day, her answers were shorter, less animated. It wasn't just one thing. It was the accumulation of subtle changes that began to gnaw at him. One evening, as Emily worked late again, Ben sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe reassurance, maybe answers. He opened their shared calendar, where Emily usually logged her work meetings and personal plans. The date of the receipt wasn't marked, and her entries around that time were vague. He told himself he was being paranoid, that it was just a one-off dinner. But a tiny voice in the back of his mind whispered otherwise. That voice grew louder when he found another odd clue a few days later. While cleaning out the car, he discovered a small velvet box tucked under the passenger seat. His heart raced as he opened it. expecting to find a gift for him or their daughters. Instead, he found an expensive bracelet, one he had never seen Emily wear. Ben's mind reeled. He closed the box and carefully placed it back where he found it, his chest tight with unease. The bracelet wasn't for him. He was sure of that now, and Emily wasn't the type to splurge on herself without mentioning it. That left only one possibility, and it made his blood run cold. Still, he couldn't bring himself to confront her directly. What if he was wrong? What if there was a perfectly innocent explanation for everything? He decided he needed more information before taking any action. Later that week, Ben noticed an opportunity to check Emily's phone. She had left it on the counter while she stepped out to water the plants. His hands trembled as he picked it up, his mind racing. But when he tried to unlock it, he was met with a passcode he didn't recognize. She had changed it. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Emily had never kept secrets from him before. Or at least, he thought she hadn't. Now, it felt like there was a wall between them, one he couldn't see over or break through. That night, as Ben lay awake in bed, he made a decision. He couldn't let the uncertainty eat away at him. He needed answers, no matter how painful they might be. As days turned into weeks, Ben found himself living in a fog of doubt and unease. He went about his routine, driving Lily and Claire to school, working long hours at his computer, and making dinner. But everything felt off. Emily was more distant than ever. When she wasn't working late in her office, she was glued to her phone, texting with a secretive smile that Ben hadn't seen in years, not since the early days of their own relationship. One evening, Ben sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched plate of spaghetti. Emily was upstairs, her laughter faintly echoing through the floorboards as she chatted with someone on the phone. He clenched his fork tighter. She didn't laugh like that with him anymore. He couldn't take it. He had to do something. That night, after Emily fell asleep, he made his way to her home office, where she often left her laptop. Sure enough, it was there, the screen dark, but still faintly warm. Ben hesitated, his heart pounding. He knew snooping wasn't right, but this wasn't about curiosity. It was about salvaging his peace of mind. He powered on the laptop and clicked on her email. She was still logged in. His stomach churned as he scanned her inbox, searching for anything unusual. Most messages were work-related, client inquiries, project updates, but then one caught his eye. It was from someone named Jake, with the subject line, "Last night." Ben's breath hitched as he clicked on it. The email was short but intimate. "Can't stop thinking about last night. Let's plan another trip soon, miss you already." Ben felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't paranoia. This was proof Emily was seeing someone else, someone she cared about enough to share moments she should have been sharing with him. His hands shook as he closed the laptop and sat there in the dark, trying to process what he had just learned. The next day, Ben decided to confront Emily. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Over breakfast, as Emily sipped her coffee and glanced at her phone, Ben cleared his throat. "Who's Jake?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. Emily froze, her smile faltering. "What?" she said, trying to sound casual, but the panic in her eyes betrayed her. "I saw the email," Ben said, his heart pounding. "I know about last night, about your trip. So I'll ask again, who is Jake?" Emily set her mug down slowly, her expression hardening. "You went through my email," she snapped, deflecting the question. "Don't turn this on me," Ben shot back. "I wouldn't have had to if you hadn't been lying to me." There was a long, heavy silence between them. Finally, Emily sighed and rubbed her temples. "Jake is just a friend," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "He's a client I've been working with closely on a big campaign, that's all." Ben wanted to believe her. He wanted so badly for this to be a misunderstanding, for everything to go back to the way it was. But the look in her eyes told him she was lying. He didn't push further. Not yet. Instead, he decided to gather more evidence. That weekend, Ben hired a private investigator. He hated the idea of spying on his wife, but he needed the truth, whatever it was. The PI, a sharp and discreet woman named Rachel, assured him she'd handle everything with care. A few days later, Rachel called with an update. "We've been tracking Emily's movements," she said. "She met with Jake at a hotel downtown last night. We have photos." Ben felt his stomach drop. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to have confirmation Rachel sent over the photos. And as Ben opened them, he felt a mix of anger and heartbreak. There was Emily, laughing and holding hands with a man he'd never seen before. They looked happy, carefree, like a couple deeply in love. It was a stark contrast to the cold, distant woman he'd been living with. When Emily came home that evening, Ben was waiting for her. He held the photos in his hand, his jaw tight with resolve. "Care to explain this?" he said, holding the pictures out to her. Emily's face went pale. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, but then she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't," Ben said, his voice breaking. "Don't insult me by pretending this isn't exactly what it looks like." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but Ben didn't feel sympathy. Not this time. He had spent weeks questioning himself, doubting his instincts, all while she carried on with her betrayal. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "You've been lying to me. To our family, I deserve better than this." Emily tried to argue, to explain, but Ben wasn't listening. The trust between them had been shattered, and no amount of excuses could fix it. After their confrontation, Ben moved into the guest room. The once warm home they had built together felt cold and uninviting. He focused on his daughters, pouring all his energy into being the best father he could be for Lily and Claire. But the pain of Emily's betrayal lingered, like a wound that refused to heal. One evening, as Ben sat on the couch watching his daughters play, he realized something: Emily's choices didn't define him. He wasn't going to let her actions destroy the life he had built. It was time to take control of his story and start rebuilding, piece by piece. And remember, if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. As the weeks dragged on, the tension between Ben and Emily became unbearable. The house was no longer a home. It was a battlefield. Conversations were clipped, silence hung heavy in the air, and every shared glance felt like a confrontation waiting to happen. Ben knew he couldn't keep living like this, but the next steps felt impossibly daunting. Meanwhile, Emily had started spending more nights away, claiming work emergencies or late client meetings. Ben no longer needed to guess where she was. He knew. The private investigator's photos had painted a painfully clear picture. Yet, Ben wasn't ready to share the truth with anyone else. Not his daughters, not their families, not even his closest friends. He was still trying to make sense of it all himself. One night, after putting Lily and Claire to bed, Ben found himself in the kitchen, staring at the family photo that hung on the wall. In it, Emily was smiling brightly, her arms wrapped around their daughters, while Ben stood beside her, beaming with pride. He couldn't reconcile the woman in the photo with the one who was now sneaking out to be with someone else. Just as he was about to turn away, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Rachel, the private investigator. "You need to see this, call me ASAP." Ben's stomach sank. Whatever it was, he knew it wasn't going to be good. He stepped outside onto the porch and dialed Rachel's number. She picked up on the first ring. "Ben," she said, her tone serious, I think things are worse than we initially thought." "What do you mean?" Ben asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Emily and Jake aren't just having an affair. We've uncovered evidence suggesting they've been funneling money from your joint accounts. It looks like they've been planning this for a while." The words hit Ben like a freight train. It wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was theft, betrayal on an entirely different level. His mind raced. How long had this been going on? How much money had they taken and for what? Rachel continued, her voice calm but firm. "I've compiled all the financial records I could find. I'll send them over to you tonight. You need to review them and decide how you want to proceed. But Ben, you need to act quickly. If they're planning to disappear with this money, you don't have much time." After the call ended, Ben sat on the porch, staring into the night. His initial heartbreak had transformed into a seething anger. Emily hadn't just betrayed their marriage. She had betrayed their family, their future. He couldn't sit idly by any longer. The next morning, Ben contacted a lawyer, Victor, who came highly recommended by a close friend. Victor listened carefully as Ben laid out the situation, nodding thoughtfully as he flipped through the evidence Rachel had provided. "You've got a strong case here," Victor said. "We're not just dealing with infidelity. This is fraud. We can file for divorce and pursue legal action to recover the stolen funds, but we need more concrete evidence to make your case airtight." Ben nodded. "Whatever it takes, I just want to protect my daughters and make sure she can't get away with this." A few days later, Ben decided it was time to confront Emily again. He waited until she came home from one of her so-called client meetings, her hair slightly tousled and her lipstick smudged. She barely looked at him as she set her bag down and made her way to the kitchen. "We need to talk," Ben said, his voice steady but cold. Emily sighed, clearly annoyed. "Can it wait? I'm exhausted." "No," Ben said firmly. "It can't." Emily turned to face him, her expression guarded. "What is it now?" Ben took a deep breath. "I know about the money. I know what you and Jake have been doing, and I've already spoken to a lawyer." For a moment, Emily's face betrayed her shock, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms defensively. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't," Ben said, his voice rising. "Don't lie to me. I have the bank records, the photos, the emails, I know everything." Emily's composure cracked. "You've been spying on me?" she spat. "You're unbelievable." "No. What's unbelievable is that you thought you could steal from me, from our family, and just walk away," Ben shot back. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Emily's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an escape. Finally, she sighed and sank into a chair at the kitchen table. "It's not what you think," she muttered. "Then explain it," Ben demanded. "Explain why you've been sneaking around with Jake and siphoning money from our accounts." Emily hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "Jake and we were planning to start a new life together, but I wasn't trying to hurt you. Ben, I wasn't happy anymore." Ben's laugh was bitter. "So your solution was to cheat on me and steal from me. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" Emily didn't answer. She just stared at the floor, her silence speaking volumes. In the days that followed, Ben threw himself into preparing for the legal battle ahead. With Victor's guidance, he filed for divorce and began the process of freezing their joint accounts to prevent Emily and Jake from accessing any more funds. It was a grueling process, but Ben felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for Lily and Claire, for the future they deserved. But the tension at home continued to escalate. Emily, now fully aware of the consequences of her actions, began lashing out. She accused Ben of trying to ruin her life, of turning their daughters against her. But Ben refused to let her manipulation get under his skin. One evening, as Ben was tucking Lily into bed, she looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy, why are you and Mommy always fighting?" she asked softly. Ben's heart broke. He didn't know how to explain the complexities of their situation to a 6-year-old. Sometimes grown-ups have problems they need to work through, he said gently. But no matter what, Mommy and Daddy both love you and Claire very much. That will never change. Lily nodded, but her small frown lingered. Ben kissed her forehead and turned off the light, vowing to shield his daughters from as much of the turmoil as he could. And just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, Ben received a call that would change everything. Rachel had uncovered another piece of evidence, one that tied Jake to even more questionable activities. It wasn't just about the money anymore. Jake had a history of fraud and was under investigation for embezzlement at his own company. Ben realized this was his opportunity to turn the tables. With Victor's help, he compiled all the evidence against Jake and Emily, preparing to present a case that would not only protect his assets, but also ensure full custody of his daughters. The evidence against Jake was damning, and the realization hit Ben like a freight train. This wasn't just a betrayal of love, it was a calculated attempt to upend his life and steal everything he held dear. With Victor's encouragement, Ben knew it was time to take decisive action. The stakes had never been higher, and the fight ahead was about more than justice. It was about survival. The turning point came when Rachel uncovered a series of emails between Jake and Emily. These weren't just love letters, they were detailed plans to transfer significant amounts of money into an offshore account. Jake had been using Emily as a pawn, leveraging her access to Ben's finances to line his own pockets. Worse yet, Emily had knowingly gone along with it. Victor called a meeting at his office, laying out the strategy. "We've got enough to expose them," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But we need to time this perfectly. If Jake catches wind of what we're planning, he might disappear, and he'll take your money with him." Ben nodded, his jaw clenched. "What do we do?" Victor leaned forward. "We're going to freeze the remaining assets immediately. Rachel has enough dirt on Jake to involve law enforcement, but we'll use that as leverage. If Emily cooperates, we might be able to salvage the situation and protect your daughters." It was a solid plan, but the thought of confronting Emily again made Ben's stomach churn. He had seen her at her worst, defensive, manipulative, and cold, but this time, he had to stay strong. There was no room for emotion now. This was war. The confrontation came that evening. Emily walked through the front door, her expression wary as she saw Ben sitting at the dining table, a folder of documents spread before him. She hesitated for a moment before setting down her bag. "What's this?" she asked, her voice sharp. Ben didn't waste time with pleasantries. "This is everything," he said, gesturing to the folder. "The emails, the bank transfers, the offshore account. I know what you and Jake have been planning." Emily's face turned pale, but she quickly masked her fear with anger. "You've been spying on me again. Do you even hear yourself?" "Cut the act, Emily," Ben snapped, his voice like ice. "This isn't about spying. This is about the fact that you've been helping a criminal steal from your own family." Her eyes darted to the folder, and for a moment, Ben thought she might deny it. But then her shoulders slumped, and she sank into the chair across from him. "I didn't have a choice," she said quietly. "Jake. He promised we'd have a fresh start. He said it was the only way." Ben stared at her in disbelief. "You didn't have a choice. You had every choice, Emily. And you chose to betray me, to betray our daughters. Do you even hear how insane that sounds?" Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but Ben refused to let them sway him. He had seen this performance before. The crocodile tears, the feigned remorse. He wasn't falling for it again. "It's over," he said firmly. "Victor has already filed the paperwork to freeze the accounts. Jake won't see another cent." Emily's tears turned to panic. "You don't understand Jake. He's dangerous if he finds out." "He'll find out," Ben interrupted, his voice unwavering. "And he'll face the consequences, but so will you. You're going to cooperate, Emily, or I'll make sure you go down with him." The next few days were a whirlwind of legal maneuvers and tense negotiations. Victor and Rachel worked tirelessly, coordinating with law enforcement to track Jake's movements. Meanwhile, Emily reluctantly provided details about Jake's plans, though her cooperation was half-hearted at best. One evening, Rachel called with an update. "Jake's on the move," she said. "We believe he's trying to withdraw the remaining funds from the offshore account, but we've tipped off the authorities. He won't get far." Ben felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in weeks, it seemed like the tide was turning in his favor. But the relief was short-lived. The climax came on a stormy night. The rain hammered against the windows as Ben sat in his living room, his nerves on edge. Victor had called earlier to say that Jake had been arrested, caught red-handed while trying to withdraw the stolen funds. But there was one loose end. Emily. As if on cue, Emily appeared in the doorway, her face a mix of desperation and defiance. "We need to talk," she said. Ben didn't look up. "I don't think there's anything left to say." "You don't understand," Emily said, stepping closer. "Jake. He's threatened me if I testify against him." "You should have thought about that before you got involved with him," Ben interrupted, his voice like steel. "I'm done cleaning up your messes, Emily." Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked truly defeated. "What's going to happen to us? To the girls?" Ben finally met her gaze, his expression hardened by weeks of betrayal and heartbreak. "The girls will be fine," he said. "I'll make sure of that. But as for us, there is no us anymore." Emily's lips trembled, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded and turned away, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. The fallout was messy, but the resolution was clear. With Jake behind bars and Emily's cooperation secured, Ben was finally able to begin rebuilding his life. The divorce was swift and decisive, with Victor ensuring that Ben retained full custody of Lily and Claire. The house, once a painful reminder of everything he had lost, became a symbol of his resilience. A place where he could start over with his daughters by his side. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when the memories of Emily's betrayal threatened to consume him. But with time, those wounds began to heal. He found solace in his daughter's laughter, in the quiet moments of peace that had once seemed impossible. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, Ben knew one thing for certain. He had survived. He had fought for his family, for his future, and for himself. And in the end, he had won. As the storm outside raged, Ben paced his living room, the tension in the air matching the chaos in his mind. Emily had retreated to her room after their tense conversation, leaving Ben to process the weight of everything that had happened. The arrests, the betrayals, and the unraveling of their life together felt like a whirlwind he could barely keep up with. But now, there was no turning back. He was on the precipice of taking control of his life again, but the final step still loomed ahead. The next morning, Ben woke to a call from Victor, his lawyer. "Jake's arraignment is scheduled for next week," Victor informed him. "We've got strong evidence, but there's a possibility Emily will be subpoenaed. How she handles that could impact the case." Ben's jaw tightened. The thought of Emily's involvement still left a sour taste in his mouth. She had played her part in this mess, but now, more than ever, it was critical that she follow through on her cooperation. Without her testimony, Jake might find a loophole to slip through. Later that day, Ben sat down with Emily in the kitchen. She looked tired, her face pale and drawn. Gone was the confident, defiant woman who had once scoffed at his accusations. In her place was someone who seemed broken, a shadow of her former self. "I need to know you'll cooperate," Ben said, his voice firm but calm. "If you testify, it will help ensure Jake is held accountable." Emily nodded slowly, avoiding his gaze. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "But I'm scared, Ben. He's not the kind of man you cross lightly. Ben's anger flared at her words. You should have thought about that before you got involved with him. You didn't just put yourself in danger, you put our daughters at risk. Emily flinched at the mention of their children, tears welling up in her eyes. I never wanted this, she whispered. I thought I was making the right choice, but it all spiraled out of control. Ben wanted to feel compassion, to believe she was truly remorseful. But it was hard to reconcile her words with her actions. Still, he knew he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment now. They had to focus on the task at hand. As the week wore on, preparations for the trial ramped up. Rachel, the private investigator, continued to unearth damning evidence against Jake, while Victor worked tirelessly to strengthen Ben's case. Emily, for her part, stayed true to her word, providing key details about Jake's schemes that bolstered the prosecution's argument. But the stress of the situation weighed heavily on everyone. Ben found himself snapping at small things, his patience worn thin by sleepless nights and the constant pressure to stay one step ahead. Even his daughters began to notice the strain. One evening, as Ben helped Claire with her math homework, she looked up at him with wide, worried eyes. Daddy, are you mad at me? She asked softly. Ben's heart ached at her question. No, sweetheart, he said, pulling her into a hug. I'm not mad at you. I'm just dealing with some grown-up problems. But it's nothing you need to worry about, okay? Claire nodded, but her frown lingered. Ben made a silent vow to shield his daughters from the fallout as much as possible. They had already endured enough turmoil. The day of Jake's arraignment arrived, bringing with it a palpable sense of tension. Ben sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched tightly in his lap as the proceedings began. Emily sat a few rows behind him, her face pale but resolute. For once, she seemed to understand the gravity of her actions. When Jake was brought into the courtroom, Ben felt a surge of anger at the sight of him. Jake was smug, his expression almost defiant as he glanced around the room. But as the evidence was presented, that smugness began to waver. Rachel's meticulous work had left no room for doubt. Jake's fraudulent activities were laid bare for all to see. The highlight of the day came when Emily took the stand. Her testimony was clear and concise, detailing how Jake had manipulated her and orchestrated the theft. Though her voice trembled at times, she remained composed, answering the prosecution's questions with honesty. For the first time in months, Ben felt a glimmer of hope. They were finally closing the door on this chapter of their lives. After the arraignment, Ben and Victor met outside the courthouse. That went as well as we could have hoped, Victor said, his tone measured. With Emily's testimony and the financial records, Jake doesn't stand a chance. Ben nodded, relief washing over him, but as he looked across the street, he spotted Emily sitting alone on a bench, her head in her hands. He hesitated for a moment before walking over to her. Emily, he said gently. She looked up, her eyes red from crying. I'm sorry, Ben, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For everything I know, I can't undo what I've done, but I want you to know how much I regret it. Ben studied her for a long moment. I appreciate your testimony, he said finally. It's a step in the right direction, but the damage is done, Emily. We can't go back to the way things were. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, she said. I just hope one day you can forgive me. Ben didn't answer. Forgiveness felt like an impossibility, at least for now, but as he walked away, he felt a sense of closure. This was the beginning of the end, and for the first time in months, he could see a path forward. The days following the arraignment were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media coverage. Jake's arrest had made headlines, and Ben found himself fielding questions from reporters and concerned friends. Through it all, he remained focused on his daughters, ensuring they felt safe and loved, despite the chaos. Emily moved out of the house shortly after the trial began, leaving Ben to rebuild his life with Lily and Claire. Though the road ahead was uncertain, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced the storm head-on and come out the other side stronger. And as he tucked his daughters into bed one night, their laughter echoing through the house, he realized that was all that truly mattered. As the trial loomed closer, the tension in Ben's life reached its peak. Each day brought new revelations, mounting pressure, and a lingering sense of unease. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the fight for justice, and the well-being of his daughters, pressed on him like an unbearable load. Yet, amid it all, he found strength he didn't know he had. Victor remained a steady presence, guiding Ben through the complexities of the legal process. Meanwhile, Rachel continued to uncover more damning evidence against Jake, solidifying the case against him. The picture of Jake as a cunning manipulator and serial fraudster was becoming clearer with each passing day. For the first time, Ben felt they had the upper hand. But the final piece of the puzzle came in the form of a surprising twist. Rachel called Ben late one evening with an unexpected update. "I found something," she said, her tone urgent. "Jake wasn't just siphoning money from your accounts. He's been laundering funds through several shell companies. And get this, one of those companies has ties to organized crime." The words hit Ben like a thunderclap. "Organized crime? Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Rachel replied. "This isn't just about him stealing from you anymore. This is part of something much bigger, and now that the authorities are involved, Jake's facing more than just fraud charges. He could be looking at serious prison time." Ben sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of this new information. Jake's crimes were far more extensive and dangerous than he had ever imagined. This revelation changed everything. Not only did it strengthen their case, but it also painted Jake as an even bigger threat to his family's safety. In the days leading up to the trial, Ben found himself oscillating between determination and dread. The tension was palpable, especially whenever he crossed paths with Emily. She seemed to sense the storm brewing, her once defiant demeanor replaced by a quiet unease. Though she had agreed to testify, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. His suspicions were confirmed the night before the trial began. As he was reviewing notes with Victor, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It read, "Meet me at the park tonight. I have something to tell you. Come alone." The message was unsigned, but Ben had a sinking feeling about who it might be. Against Victor's advice, he decided to go. He couldn't ignore the possibility that this meeting might provide the final piece of evidence he needed to protect his daughters. When Ben arrived at the park, the air was crisp and still, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. He spotted Emily sitting on a bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mix of fear and resolve. "What is this about, Emily?" Ben asked, his voice low. She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure they were alone. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I haven't told anyone." Ben's patience was wearing thin. "Then spit it out." Emily took a shaky breath. "Jake. He's been threatening me if I testify tomorrow. He said he'll come after me, and you. He has people who can make things happen." Ben's blood ran cold. "Why are you telling me this now?" he demanded. "You've had weeks to come clean." "Because I was scared," Emily shot back, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to believe he'd actually go through with it. But now, I don't know." Ben clenched his fists, his mind racing. Jake's ties to organized crime made Emily's fears all too real. But he couldn't let her panic derail everything they had worked for. "You're going to testify tomorrow," he said firmly. "And you're going to tell the truth. We'll deal with Jake's threats later. But right now, we need to focus on taking him down." Emily nodded reluctantly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Ben, for everything." Ben didn't respond. He turned and walked away, his resolve hardening with each step Jake had already taken so much from him. He wouldn't let him take anything more. The trial began the next morning, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, their pens poised to capture every detail of the high-profile case. Ben sat with Victor, his jaw tight as he watched Jake take his seat at the defendant's table. The man who had caused so much pain looked oddly calm, as if he still believed he could win. The prosecution presented its case first, laying out the evidence in meticulous detail. Bank statements, emails, surveillance photos. It was all there, a damning portrait of Jake's crimes. Ben felt a sense of vindication as he watched the jury's expressions shift from skepticism to shock. But the real turning point came when Emily took the stand. She looked nervous, but determined as she recounted how Jake had manipulated her, pressured her into participating in his schemes, and threatened her when she tried to back out. Her testimony was raw and emotional, and for the first time, Ben saw a glimmer of the woman he had once loved, a woman who, despite her mistakes, was trying to make things right. Jake's defense attorney tried to discredit her, painting her as a willing accomplice who was now trying to save herself. But Emily held her ground, her voice steady as she faced down the man who had upended her life. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the tension in the room was palpable. The jury's verdict seemed almost inevitable, but Ben knew better than to let his guard down. Anything could happen. The climax came on the final day of the trial. As the jury deliberated, Jake's true nature finally came to light. A surprise witness, one of Jake's former associates, testified about his connections to organized crime and his pattern of using people like Emily to further his schemes. The revelation was the nail in the coffin. When the jury returned, their verdict was clear. Guilty on all counts, Jake was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his smug demeanor finally replaced by a look of defeat. For Ben, it was a moment of bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but the scars of the ordeal would remain. As he left the courthouse, Ben felt a sense of relief wash over him. The nightmare was finally over. He could begin to rebuild his life, free from the shadows of betrayal and deceit. And as he looked down at Lily and Claire, who had been waiting outside with his sister, he realized that was all that truly mattered. In the days following the trial, the weight on Ben's shoulders began to lift. Jake was behind bars, and Emily's testimony had played a significant role in ensuring justice was served. Though their marriage was irreparably broken, Ben felt a sense of closure. He had faced the storm head-on and emerged stronger, not only for himself, but for his daughters as well. The first step in rebuilding his life was moving out of the house. The memories within its walls, both joyful and painful, were too overwhelming to bear. With the help of his sister and a few close friends, Ben packed up their belongings and found a new home on the edge of town. It was smaller and quieter, but felt like a blank slate, a place where he could create new memories with Lily and Claire. Emily, meanwhile, moved into an apartment closer to her workplace. Though she had expressed a desire to repair her relationship with her daughters, Ben had insisted on maintaining full custody. It wasn't about punishment. It was about ensuring the girls had a stable, loving environment. Emily would still have visitation rights, but Ben was firm in his decision to prioritize their well-being above all else. As the weeks turned into months, Ben began to find a new rhythm. The chaos that had consumed his life was replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. His days were filled with school drop-offs, work, and family dinners, while his evenings were spent helping Lily and Claire with their homework or reading bedtime stories. It wasn't the life he had envisioned, but it was one he was determined to make the most of. Surprisingly, Ben also found himself rediscovering parts of himself he had long forgotten. He took up painting again, a hobby he hadn't touched since college. He even joined a local hiking group, finding solace in the simple act of being outdoors. These small moments of joy reminded him that healing was possible. even after the deepest wounds. One afternoon, as Ben was painting in the small studio he had set up in the new house, Claire wandered in. She watched him quietly for a moment before asking, "Can I try?" Ben smiled and handed her a brush. Together they spent the afternoon creating a colourful, chaotic masterpiece on the canvas. It was messy and imperfect, but to Ben, it was beautiful, a symbol of the life they were rebuilding. Emily's presence in their lives remained limited but amicable. She attended Lily's piano recitals and Claire's soccer games, always keeping a respectful distance. Though their interactions were cordial, Ben remained cautious. Trust was something that would take years, if not a lifetime, to rebuild. One day, after dropping the girls off at Emily's for a weekend visit, Emily pulled Ben aside. "I just want to say thank you," she said. "For letting me be a part of their lives. I know I don't deserve it after everything I've done." Ben nodded, his expression neutral. "They deserve both parents in their lives," he said simply. "But don't mistake that for forgiveness. That's something you'll have to earn." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded and stepped back, letting Ben leave without another word. The turning point for Ben came nearly a year after the trial. One evening, as he sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Lily joined him. She climbed onto his lap, resting her head against his chest. "Are you happy, Daddy?" she asked, her voice soft. Ben looked down at her, surprised by the question. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "Because you smile more now," she said. "And you laugh more. I like it." Ben felt a lump rise in his throat. He wrapped his arms around her tightly and whispered, "Yes, Lily. I'm happy because I have you and Claire, and that's all I need." As life slowly settled into its new normal, Ben began to look toward the future with hope. He focused on his daughters, his passions, and the community he was building around him. He had learned the hard way that life didn't always go as planned, but it was those unexpected detours that often led to the most meaningful destinations. Though the scars of his past would always remain, Ben no longer let them define him. Instead, he chose to embrace the lessons they had taught him: resilience, self-worth, and the power of unconditional love. And there you have it, a story of heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately redemption. Ben's journey wasn't easy, but it's a testament to the strength we all have within us to rise above even the darkest of times. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, hit the like button, share with your friends, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.